When Michael Harrison tried to add a small porch to his Lakewood home, he was met with relentless threats from Frank Keller, the overbearing HOA president. Frank's obsession with control turned every letter, every neighborhood meeting into a campaign of intimidation. But Michael refused to back down, transforming his small project into a magnificent wraparound veranda that left the community in awe. And just wait to see how this daring move flipped the tables and why justice in the end triumphed spectacularly. I'm Michael Harrison, and I thought moving into my new home in suburban Lakewood would be the start of a calm, simple chapter in my life. After years of cramped apartments and city noise, the idea of waking up to the sound of birds, sipping coffee on my porch, and watching the neighborhood slowly come alive in the morning light felt like a dream. The house itself was perfect. Brick exterior, wide windows that let in the sun, and enough space in the backyard to imagine summer barbecues and family gatherings. It was everything I had hoped for, a place that felt like it could finally be mine. Within the first few weeks, I began to personalize my space, doing small things that made the house feel like home. Painting walls, arranging furniture, planting flowers along the walkway. It was all small, joyful adjustments. One of the first projects I tackled was a modest front porch addition. Nothing extravagant, just a corner where I could place a couple of chairs and a small table, a space where I could sit with my morning coffee, read the newspaper, or watch the sunrise. In my mind, it was a tiny, harmless improvement, a touch of comfort and charm to the front of my house. I had checked the HOA rules, or so I thought, and nothing seemed to suggest that this small addition would be a problem. I had even asked a neighbor who had made similar improvements, and they assured me that minor porch updates were generally acceptable. The whole process felt straightforward, quiet, and positive. I imagined myself enjoying lazy Saturday mornings, waving to neighbors walking their dogs, and feeling that subtle but satisfying sense of pride that comes from shaping your own space. Then, one morning, everything changed. I was standing on the porch holding my coffee mug, admiring the fresh paint and newly installed railings, when I heard a knock at the door. At first, I thought it was a delivery, or perhaps a neighbor stopping by to chat. But when I opened the door, I found myself staring at Frank Keller, the HOA president, looking every bit like someone who had come prepared for confrontation. His posture was rigid, his expression tight, and in his hand was a thick folder, presumably full of HOA rules and regulations. "This addition violates the rules," he said, his tone firm and unmistakably serious. "Remove it, or weekly fines will follow." I froze. The words seemed to hang in the air, impossible and surreal. My heart started to pound, and for a moment I couldn't speak. I blinked, thinking perhaps I had misunderstood. "Excuse me?" I finally managed, my voice barely above a whisper. He repeated himself, even more insistently this time. "You need to remove that porch. It's not allowed under HOA guidelines, and fines will begin immediately if it's not taken down." I couldn't believe it. A tiny porch, a space meant to bring a little joy to my mornings, was now at the center of what felt like a full-blown storm. My mind raced. How could something so small, so innocuous, trigger such a reaction? Why was this person standing on my doorstep, holding the power to penalize me for simply trying to improve my home? The sense of shock was overwhelming. This was not just a disagreement or a minor inconvenience. It was a sudden, unanticipated threat to the life I had been carefully building. As Frank left, I stood there in stunned silence, gripping the edge of the doorway. The neighborhood that had seemed so welcoming now felt tense, like the calm before a storm I hadn't seen coming. That morning, the simple act of trying to enjoy my own home became a catalyst for a conflict I never expected. And in that moment, I realized something had shifted. My peaceful suburban dream had just collided with the harsh reality of authority, rules, and an almost inexplicable sense of control. I was in shock, and deep down, I knew this was only the beginning. After that first shocking confrontation, I thought perhaps the situation would calm down. Maybe Frank Keller would realize that my small porch was harmless and move on. I had been naive to think that common sense could prevail. Within days, it became clear that Frank's interest wasn't about rules or community standards. It was about asserting control. At first, it was subtle. I started receiving letters slipped under my door, each one more formal, more intimidating than the last. The tone was rigid, impersonal, almost mechanical, like someone reciting a script. "This structure is non-compliant," one letter began. "Immediate corrective action is required to avoid fines." At first, I tried to brush it off, thinking it was just standard procedure, but the letters kept coming, piling up on my doorstep, each one carrying a weight that made the walls of my home feel smaller and tighter. Then came the photographs. At first, I didn't notice them. Tucked discreetly between pages of another letter, they were pictures of my porch, taken from odd angles, sometimes capturing me sipping coffee or adjusting a chair. It was unsettling. Someone had been watching my every move, documenting each minor change. It wasn't about keeping the neighborhood safe or enforcing rules. It was about making me feel scrutinized, exposed, and vulnerable in my own home. The next escalation came in the form of neighborhood meetings. Frank had a way of twisting words, of presenting the situation as though I was the one disturbing the peace. I remember sitting in the community hall, surrounded by neighbors I had thought were friendly, while he held up diagrams of my porch and accused me of undermining the harmony of our community. The word harmony echoed in the room, though the atmosphere felt anything but harmonious. It was a performance, and I realized I had become the unwilling star. Each comment, each pointed remark was designed to make me question myself, to cast doubt in the eyes of my neighbors. At first, I felt confusion. Why would someone dedicate so much energy to one small addition? Then, slowly, that confusion hardened into something else. Hatred, not reckless or irrational hatred, but a sharp, burning awareness that this was intentional. Frank's actions weren't about keeping order or protecting the community. They were about showing power. Every letter, every photograph, every pointed accusation was a way to assert dominance, to remind me and everyone else that he controlled the narrative of this neighborhood. I found myself thinking about him constantly, analyzing his motives, and wondering how far he might go. Was there ever a limit to this? The more I watched, the more I saw that Frank thrived on the discomfort he caused. And with each letter that arrived, with each meeting where his words twisted reality, my resentment grew, feeding on his audacity. It wasn't just anger, it was a profound sense of injustice, a recognition that someone could take such an interest in controlling a life that wasn't theirs. Even my neighbors began to notice the tension. Some offered sympathetic nods, while others whispered about Frank's relentless persistence. Yet despite their awareness, no one had the courage, or perhaps the energy, to confront him directly. That left me standing alone, surrounded by the traces of his campaign against something as small and personal as a porch. I realized that this wasn't a battle over architecture, or aesthetics, or even neighborhood rules. It was a battle over autonomy, over dignity, over the simple right to enjoy one's own home without fear of harassment. And in that realization, my hatred solidified. It wasn't blind or petty. It was focused, deliberate, and simmering. I knew I couldn't ignore it, and I couldn't back down. Each day of harassment stoked a fire within me, a determination that I wouldn't let this small act of intimidation define my life or my home. By the end of the month, every letter, every photograph, and every public accusation had transformed me. What began as confusion and disbelief had grown into a quiet, burning resolve. I understood now. Frank Keller wasn't just enforcing rules. He was trying to humiliate me, and that, more than anything else, made me hate him. That evening, the envelope felt heavier than usual in my hands. Another letter from Frank Keller had arrived, its words as cold and rigid as the metal stamps he used to send them. Immediate corrective action required, it read. But this time, I didn't feel shock or confusion. I felt something else, something hotter, something insistent. Anger. Not the fleeting kind, but the kind that burns steady and demands action. I set the letter aside, pacing the living room, feeling a tide of frustration rise with each heartbeat. I looked at the corner of my yard where my small porch had once been. Just a simple structure intended for quiet mornings with coffee and a book. And yet, it had sparked weeks of scrutiny, gossip, and harassment. That innocent little corner of my life had become the epicenter of Frank Keller's obsession with control. I realized with a clarity that surprised me that if he wanted a battle, I would give him one. Not a timid stand, but a declaration that this house, this home, and my sense of autonomy were mine to protect. I retrieved my blueprints, the ones I had sketched when imagining a peaceful porch. My anger reshaped them in an instant. This wasn't going to be a small addition. It was going to be a statement. A wraparound veranda that encircled the entire house, wide enough for laughter, gatherings, and quiet moments alike. A structure so bold that it would transform my home from a modest suburban dwelling into a symbol of defiance. Work began the very next day. The sound of hammers striking nails became my battle cry, the rhythmic pounding echoing in the streets. I poured every ounce of frustration, every pang of indignation into the construction. Neighbors watched with wide eyes, whispering as the framework rose with astonishing speed. Some shook their heads, unsure whether to admire or pity my audacity. Others offered words of encouragement, perhaps sensing the courage it took to stand against relentless pressure. As the veranda took shape, I moved with purpose. Each plank I laid, each nail I drove, carried the weight of weeks of irritation and humiliation. I worked into the night, headlamp on, hands worn and calloused, refusing to let fatigue or doubt slow me down. The house was no longer just a home. It was a battleground, every corner a testament to resolve, every beam a declaration that intimidation would not dictate my life. Frank's threats now felt distant, almost absurd compared to the energy that fueled me. For the first time, I felt in control. My anger had been transformed into creation, into something visible, something undeniable. It wasn't reckless. It was deliberate. Every angle of the veranda was planned, every curve precise, designed not just for aesthetics, but for the satisfaction of knowing that I had taken control of a situation that had once seemed impossible to fight. As the days passed, the structure began to encircle the house completely, creating a continuous platform that invited neighbors to imagine summer evenings filled with conversation, music, and sunlight. The whispers in the street grew louder, not of judgment, but of awe. People stopped to watch, some bringing water, some offering encouragement, others simply shaking their heads in amazement. They were witnessing a transformation, not just of the house, but of a man refusing to be cornered by petty authority. By the time the veranda was nearly complete, I stood on the far side of the house, surveying the work with a mix of exhaustion and pride. My anger had driven me to action, yes, but it had also shaped something enduring. It was no longer merely a reaction, it was an assertion. Frank Keller and anyone else who thought they could intimidate me had been shown that my determination was unshakable. And in that realization, a strange calm settled over me. The fury that had fueled every movement softened into a steady, purposeful energy. I had turned frustration into craftsmanship, threats into action, and harassment into an opportunity to reclaim my space. This veranda wasn't just wood and nails. It was a declaration of autonomy, a monument to resilience, and a promise that intimidation would never dictate the life I intended to live. The day finally arrived when the last nail had been driven, the final plank polished, and every flower perfectly planted along the edges of the wraparound veranda. I stepped back and looked at the house in a way I hadn't before. It wasn't just a structure, it was a statement, a triumph of persistence, vision, and unwavering determination. Twice the size of the porch I had originally planned, it wrapped around the house like a protective embrace, every curve and corner designed for comfort, gathering, and the simple joy of living fully in my own space. I could already imagine evenings spent sipping tea on the swings, mornings with coffee in the sunlight, neighbors laughing and chatting in the fresh air. The house had been transformed into a haven. I knew it was time to share this triumph, not just with my family, but with the people who had watched the slow unfolding of this defiance. The neighborhood. I printed invitations for the grand opening and personally walked around, inviting every household on our street. Some greeted me with curiosity, some with restrained smiles, and a few with wide-eyed amazement. There was an unspoken excitement in the air, a sense that something unusual and significant was about to happen. On the day of the gathering, the sun shone brightly, casting a warm glow across the freshly stained wood and colorful flowers. Comfortable chairs lined the veranda, swings gently swayed with the breeze, and small tables held refreshments. Neighbors began to arrive, each reaction unfolding like a small revelation. There were gasps of surprise, smiles that widened into genuine appreciation, and quiet murmurs of admiration. Children ran along the perimeter, weaving between the railings and exploring the new space with delight. I watched it all, feeling a growing sense of pride and joy well up inside me. Frank Keller arrived eventually, as if compelled to witness what he had tried so hard to suppress. He lingered near the edge of the crowd, clipboard in hand, ready to scan for violations. But this time there was nothing. No rule had been broken, no regulation left unchecked, and the neighborhood, my neighbors who had observed everything, stood firmly in silent support. No one followed Frank's gaze or echoed his criticisms. Instead, they marveled at the veranda's design, the thoughtfulness of every feature, and the way the project had not just added to the house, but enhanced the spirit of the street. Frank's attempts at intimidation were futile here. The beauty and practicality of what we had built rendered his authority powerless. I caught the eye of a few neighbors and saw expressions of pride, understanding, and solidarity. They understood what this veranda represented, not just a structure of wood and nails, but a testament to standing firm, asserting personal autonomy, and reclaiming dignity in the face of relentless pressure. And I realized in a way I hadn't before that this victory wasn't mine alone. It belonged to the community as well, the collective acknowledgement that fairness, thoughtfulness, and courage can outweigh arbitrary control and intimidation. Standing on the veranda, feeling the sun on my face and the gentle creak of the swings beneath me, I felt complete satisfaction. The weeks of struggle, the anger, the planning, the hard labor, they had all culminated in a moment of triumph that was tangible, visible, and enduring. I had protected my home, my sense of self, and my pride. I had turned frustration into beauty, conflict into creativity, and threats into a lasting achievement. Frank, for all his attempts to assert dominance, could do nothing now. He was powerless, observing from the sidelines, a silent reminder that intention alone cannot outweigh resilience and vision. The crowd's admiration was a quiet but powerful rebuke to the weeks of hostility he had tried to impose. In that moment, I understood the deeper satisfaction of this project. It wasn't just about winning against one person. It was about affirming that integrity, perseverance, and a commitment to what is right can transform even the most oppressive situations into triumphs. As the sun began to dip toward the horizon, casting long golden shadows across the wood, I leaned against the railing, listening to laughter and conversation all around. My veranda had become more than a home improvement project. It was a symbol of resilience, a canvas painted with effort and intention, and a sanctuary for joy. And in that perfect, quiet moment of reflection, I knew without doubt justice had prevailed, and the harmony we had built together was unshakable.